Hey, come in. Sit down. Get comfortable. Blanket, warm drink, whatever makes you feel settled, because we're about to spend a long time together in a very strange and very beautiful place. Tonight we're heading back to Gravity Falls. Not the version you remember from your first watch, not the bright colors and fun monsters, and the silly, grumpy uncle and the comedy and the chaos. We're going somewhere deeper than that. We're going to the stories that live underneath the show, the ones that the main episodes never had quite enough time to fully tell. The ones buried in companion books and creator interviews and cryptograms that took the fandom years to crack open. We're going to the parts of the mythology that most people skip over or never find at all. 10 stories. All of them quieter than you might expect. All of them stranger and all of them more human than a cartoon about a triangle demon with a top hat has any right to be. Now I know some of you are here to genuinely relax. Some of you have got the lights turned down low, maybe a candle going, maybe you're already drifting toward the edge of sleep. That's exactly what this is for. These stories are meant to be immersive, meant to be slow and careful and atmospheric, meant to feel like someone's sitting across from you in a comfortable room telling you something true. And some of you are here because you love Gravity Falls and you want to go deeper into it than you've gone before. That's also exactly what this is for. And some of you are probably both of those things at once, which is the best possible combination. Get cozy. This one takes a while, and honestly, by the end of it, you might look at Gravity Falls a little differently, not darker, necessarily, just fuller. Like a room you've walked through 100 times suddenly having a light turned on in a corner you never noticed before. Like a piece of music you've heard so many times you can hum it without thinking, and then one day you actually sit down and listen to it and hear a voice underneath the melody you somehow always missed. That's what these stories are. The voice underneath. Let's begin. Before we get into story 1, drop a comment below right now and let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Seriously, I read every single one of them and I never get tired of it. There is something I find genuinely moving about knowing that someone is lying in bed in Auckland at 2 in the morning with their phone screen turned all the way down, or curled up on a couch in Scotland in the grey afternoon, or watching from a kitchen table in Sao Paulo with a cup of coffee that's gone cold. All of us in different places, different times, different lives, listening to the same strange story together. It's one of the best things about doing this. Don't be shy, leave the comment. And if you haven't already subscribed, please do. It's completely free, it takes 1 second, and it makes an enormous difference in terms of whether the algorithm decides other people should find these videos. Okay, story 1. Story 1. The Valley That Shouldn't Exist. The True Origin of Gravity. Falls before there was a mystery shack. Before there were journals or portals or a dream demon with a top hat and a fondness for deal-making. Before Stan or Ford or Dipper or Mabel. Before gnomes or Gideon or the Society of the Blind Eye or any of the 100 creatures and mysteries that make up the mythology of the show. Before even the town of Gravity Falls itself, there was a crash. A very old crash, millions of years old. So old that by the time human beings found themselves standing in this particular valley in the Pacific Northwest of Oregon, there was no visible wreckage, no obvious scar in the landscape, no sign that anything out of the ordinary had ever happened here at all. Just a valley, dense conifer forest, soft dark soil, a river you could hear if you stood very still and listened carefully through the sound of the wind. The smell of pine and damp earth and something else underneath all of it, something you couldn't quite put a name to. Something that put the hairs on your arms up slightly without explaining why. Something like the air right before a summer storm, except the storm never comes. That charged, expectant quality that never quite resolves. Here's what the canonical lore of Gravity Falls tells us, confirmed in the 2nd season of the show and expanded in Ford Pines' own journals. The valley that the town was built inside was formed by the impact of a crashed extraterrestrial vessel millions of years ago. An actual spacecraft from somewhere beyond our solar system came down in this particular patch of Oregon and did not leave. It buried itself deep in the earth on impact, and over the course of millions of years, the landscape absorbed it entirely. Trees grew over it. Layers of soil accumulated above it. The river found its natural path around the edges of the ancient impact crater without ever revealing what lay beneath the valley floor. To anyone walking through this forest, to any of the thousands of years of human beings who eventually came to live in and around this particular place, there was nothing unusual to see, just trees and water and rock and the peculiar, unnameable feeling that this ground was somehow different from other ground. The scale of the timeline here is worth pausing on. Millions of years. The vessel crashed before there were human beings anywhere on Earth in the form we'd currently recognize. Before the last ice age, before the continent's forests had taken their current shape, before the Oregon coast was the Oregon coast in any geological sense we'd find familiar. Whatever came down in this valley came from somewhere so far away and existed in so foreign a technological register that it might as well have been magic. Except that it followed physical laws, even if those laws were different from ours. It was real. It was physical. And it had been lying in the earth under this particular patch of Pacific Northwest forest since before anything that looks like our world existed above it. But here's the crucial thing about a vessel that size, carrying technology that far beyond anything our planet had ever produced. It doesn't simply go dark when it crashes. It doesn't just lie quiet in the earth and become inert. Technology of that sophistication, whatever was powering it, whatever systems it ran on, whatever the purpose of its original journey, doesn't stop working simply because the craft is no longer intact. It leaks. Like a battery that's been punctured, it seeps energy into its immediate environment, slowly, over the course of millions of years, into the ground, into the water table, into the bedrock of the hills, into the root systems of the trees, into the behavior of the animals that make their homes here, into the character of the light at different times of day. And that energy warped the local environment in ways that became more pronounced over time rather than less. The longer the vessel sat in the earth, the deeper the transformation went, pushing the valley in a direction that nature, left entirely to its own devices, would never have reached. The result was a valley where the laws of physics are optional rather than mandatory, where creatures evolve along biological lines that conventional science cannot account for, where the boundary between the physical world and whatever exists alongside it, between our dimension and the dimensions that exist parallel to it, between the ordinary and whatever Bill Cipher eventually found his way out of the nightmare realm into, is thinner than it should be by any reasonable measure. Almost permeable. Almost like a membrane that, given the right kind of pressure applied at exactly the right point, would allow something through. Stanford Pines discovered this during his years of research in the valley, and he recorded it carefully in Journal 3. The floating cliffs visible from certain angles on the edge of town, defying gravity in the most literal possible sense. The strange atmospheric phenomena, the unexplained lights, the weather patterns that didn't match any surrounding region. The unnatural concentration of supernatural creatures and events. All of it, Ford concluded after years of study, traced back to that original ancient impact. The town didn't attract the supernatural. The town was built inside the supernatural. The people who lived there, Lazy Susan and Tyler the cute biker, and the man who married a woodpecker and Sheriff Blubbs and all the rest of them, are residents, whether they have any idea about it or not, of ground zero of an extraterrestrial energy event that has been ongoing for longer than humanity has existed as a species. There is something profound in that, I think, because the show consistently treats Gravity Falls as a special place, the kind of place that feels like it exists slightly outside normal time and space. Somewhere you can only really access in summer, when you're 12 years old, when everything feels more possible than it will ever feel again. The specialness of the town, the quality that makes it feel different from every other place, turns out to have a literal cause in the show's mythology. It is not magic in the mystical, unexplained sense. It is physics. Specific, traceable, bizarre physics, but physics nonetheless. The town feels different because it is different, has been different for millions of years, and will continue to be different long after every human character in the show is gone. Ford's journals also contain an entry, visible only under blacklight, in which he documents having located and explored the UFO itself, buried deep beneath the valley floor. He describes corridors and chambers of alien design, technology he cannot identify, materials unlike anything in any terrestrial engineering database. He describes the quality of the darkness down there. Not the ordinary dark of an unlit room, which your eyes eventually begin to adjust to, but a complete and absolute blackness that his flashlight seemed to push back rather than penetrate, as if the dark had structural properties, as if it was something rather than merely the absence of something. He describes the walls of the alien corridors as smooth and jointless, not fabricated in any way he recognizes. No seams, no rivets, no visible construction logic. The material was neither warm nor cold to the touch. He tapped it with the heel of his hand, and it produced no sound, absorbed the impact entirely the way very dense materials sometimes will, or the way a surface will absorb impact if there is nothing on the other side of it. As if the walls had no other side, as if pressing against them was pressing against the edge of the structure of reality itself. He found rooms that appeared to have been designed for purposes he could not reverse engineer. One contained what looked like a navigational interface. He draws it in the journal, carefully and precisely. A series of nested circles marked with symbols in a geometric language he could not translate. One appeared to be a communications array of some kind, though every operational component had long since gone dark and cold. The technology was so far beyond his ability to interpret that he could not even determine its power source, could not find anything that looked like machinery in any sense he recognized. It had functioned, on principles that human physics in the 1970s had no framework to even begin describing. He describes what appears to have been a biological containment unit, a chamber designed to hold living specimens, now empty, with claw marks in the walls and shattered glass suggesting that whatever had been contained there had, at some point long ago, gotten out. The glass had been broken from the inside. The claw marks went from the floor to about 6 feet up the wall, at which point they stopped. Not in the way that marks stop when an animal gives up or changes direction, but in the specific way they stop when something reaches a height where its weight is no longer pressing down on the surface, when it starts to move differently, when it begins to fly or float, or simply to exist differently than it existed before. And then, almost as an aside, Ford notes that the claw marks and the pattern of damage look somehow familiar. He has seen something that makes marks like that. He has studied something that breaks through containment in exactly that way. Something he found as an egg in the soil during the excavation of his underground bunker, hatched into a creature he cataloged as Experiment 2, when O gave the nickname Shifty, fed canned beans, studied with fascinated enthusiasm, and eventually had to freeze in cryogenic stasis because it became too dangerous to contain. The shapeshifter may be as old as the crash itself, may have come down with the ship, been held in biological containment for the duration of the journey, and escaped when the vessel's systems failed on impact. May have spent millions of years working its way upward through the soil, slow as a glacier, adapting to every new environment it encountered, changing forms to survive in each new context. May have finally reached a depth where Ford was excavating and decided, when it felt him digging, to let itself be found. Which raises a question that no one in the show ever quite has the space to ask. If the shapeshifter is millions of years old rather than merely decades, what is it really? Not just a creature Ford discovered, but an entity of vastly greater age and experience than any of the human characters in the story, potentially playing a game that operates on a timescale no human being could fully comprehend. We will come back to Shifty in a later story, but for now, the valley, the crash, the millions of years of alien energy bleeding into Oregon soil, turning the local physics into something strange and wonderful and dangerous. The town that was built here without its founders understanding, or perhaps without caring, that the ground under their feet was not like other ground. The origin of Gravity Falls is a story without a clear beginning, in that the beginning is buried too deep and too long ago to fully excavate. But knowing it changes the way you see everything else that happens in the valley. The weirdness is the place is the weirdness. And every story we're going to tell tonight is, in some way, a story that started with that ancient crash, a story that began before any of the characters we love were born, before anyone consciously chose this place, before anyone even knew there was anything here worth choosing. The Mystery Shack was built over a portal to another dimension. The portal was built above a crashed alien spacecraft. The alien spacecraft was the source of every impossible thing the town ever produced. And at the top of all of this, visible from the highway, charging $5 admission, keeping the lights on with gift shop revenue and slightly misleading tourist pamphlets, Grunkle Stan in his fez, waving at passing cars. That is Gravity Falls. That has always been Gravity Falls, a place of unfathomable strangeness with a parking lot out front and a friendly sign. Story 2. The World That Bill Cipher Burned. The Tragedy of Euclidia. To understand Bill Cipher, really understand him, not just as a force of narrative chaos, not just as the smiling yellow nightmare who turns people into living statues and laughs about it, you have to go further back than the nightmare realm. Further back than the deals and the manipulation and the trillion or so years of scheming to break through into the physical world. You have to go back to a place called Euclidia, and to a version of Bill Cipher who was, by all available evidence, not a monster at all. The Book of Bill was published in 2024, written by Alex Hirsch and canonically set in the Gravity Falls universe. It is billed with characteristic meta-humor as a book written by Bill himself from his current place of confinement. But beneath the unreliable narration and the jokes and the deliberate misdirections, it contains the most complete portrait we have of who Bill Cipher was before everything went catastrophically, irreparably wrong. Euclidia was a two-dimensional world. Literally, physically two-dimensional. A flat plane of existence where everyone and everything lived as geometric shapes, where reality had length and width, but no depth, no height, no third dimension in any meaningful sense. The geometry of the place was its culture, its language, its social structure. Different shapes held different places in Euclidia's social order. To be a triangle was one thing, to be a square was another. The entire civilization was organized along the lines of Euclidean geometry, which is where the name comes from, and which is also a clear reference to the 1884 novel Flatland by Edwin Abbott Abbott. Abbott wrote Flatland as a thought experiment and a satire of Victorian class structures. His narrator is a square who encounters a sphere and is invited to perceive the third dimension, and who is then imprisoned for claiming that this third dimension exists because the social order of Flatland depends on everyone accepting the limitations of their world. Alex Hirsch read this and found, underneath the mathematical satire, a different story. The tragedy of being able to see what no one around you can see. Think about what Euclidia must have been, as a place, before everything ended. A civilization of geometric beings living in a flat world, which means a world where you never see anyone's face head-on, where everyone moves in a single plane, where the concept of above and below doesn't exist the way it does for us. The sky of Euclidia, if it had a sky, was not above in the way our sky is above. It was simply there, the same plane as everything else, the same flat expanse of existence extending in every direction without a third axis to organize it. The social hierarchies were mathematical. More sides meant higher status. A triangle, like Bill, sat at one level, squares and pentagons and hexagons above them. The circle, having infinite sides, was a kind of god figure. The civilization had its own beauty, its own logic, its own way of understanding relationships and movement and connection. All of it native to two dimensions. All of it built for and by beings who had no frame of reference for anything beyond the plane they existed on. Bill Cipher was born in Euclidia to parents named Scalene and Euclid, names that are themselves mathematical terms, precise and geometric, because this universe consistently rewards attention to detail. From birth, he was different. He had a mutation, a crack in his flat existence that allowed him to perceive the third dimension. He could see depth. He could perceive volume. He could, in a world of pure flatness, look in a direction that no one else in his world had a word for. Try to imagine what this is. Not abstractly, but actually. You live in a world with two directions. Everyone you know and love and interact with lives in two directions. Language has evolved to describe two directions. There is no word in your world for up or down in the three-dimensional sense, because no one has ever needed one. And then you start perceiving something that none of those words cover. Something that isn't forward or backward, left or right. Something else. Something that exists in a direction your world has no name for and your entire community cannot perceive. The loneliness of that would be total. Not just social loneliness, perceptual loneliness. A loneliness built into the structure of your experience, where the richest thing you have, the thing you can see that no one else can see, is also the thing that makes you most completely alone. And his first impulse, before anything dark had entered the picture, was to share it. He wanted to show Euclidia what he could see. He wanted to give his world the gift of three-dimensionality, of the richer and more complex existence he could perceive just beyond the edge of their flat reality. He was not trying to destroy anything. He was trying to expand something. He succeeded in the most catastrophic way imaginable. The event known as the Euclidean Massacre, named in the Book of Bill and referenced in the axolotl's poem in the series finale, is never fully explained in its mechanics because Bill either genuinely doesn't know the precise details or has built so many layers of defensive denial around them that the knowledge is no longer accessible. What we know is the result. In trying to bring the third dimension to his two-dimensional world, Bill caused a catastrophic instability. A flat world encountering the physics of three-dimensional existence is not structurally equipped to survive the transition. The geometry collapses. What had been a stable, complete, inhabited plane of existence became, in the aftermath of what Bill did, nothing. Annihilated. Every shape, every geometric soul, every flat street and angled building and relationship and dream, all of it gone. Including his parents, Scalene and Euclid. Including everyone he had ever known. He survived because his mutation had partially adapted him to the existence beyond his world. He was already, in some structural sense, between dimensions. Not quite native to Euclidia, not quite native to the third dimension. The destruction that claimed everyone else passed around him or through him in a way that left him standing, if standing is the right word for an entity that no longer has a plane to stand on, in the empty space where his world used to be. He became something new, something that hadn't existed before. A two-dimensional entity unmoored from any dimension at all, capable of moving between realities, capable of existing in the spaces between worlds. He rebuilt himself in the nightmare realm. He became Bill Cipher. The axolotl's poem is one of the most precisely written pieces of text in the entire show. Every line is doing multiple things at once. It says, 60 degrees that come in threes. A triangle's interior angles. Watches from within birch trees. His presence hidden throughout the show. Saw his own dimension burn. Misses home and cannot return. And then, says he's happy, he's a liar. Blame the arson for the fire. Bill is the one who burned his world. He says he's happy, he's lying. The Book of Bill returns to this wound repeatedly and carefully. When Ford asks him, in a moment of unusual honesty, what destroyed his dimension, Bill's answer is a monster. And when Ford presses, Bill laughs joylessly, which is not a quality you'd usually associate with the yellow triangle, and says, Sixer, it would eat you alive. The monster is him. He knows, he has always known. The difficulty of living with this knowledge, the specific difficulty of being the agent of a catastrophe you intended as a gift, is something the show encodes into almost every aspect of Bill's presentation without ever making it explicit until you go looking. The perpetual smile is the most obvious tell. No entity genuinely thriving laughs as relentlessly as Bill Cipher laughs. The laughter is not expression, it is insulation. It is what you keep pointed outward so nothing can find the thing underneath. His attraction to chaos, to the dissolution of fixed structures and stable systems, is also readable in this light. Bill finds comfort in chaos because chaos is what he has lived in since Euclidia ended. A fixed world, a stable world, a world with rules and edges and a floor under your feet is the thing he destroyed. He cannot go back to that. So he builds a philosophy out of the rubble that says, fixed worlds were never valuable anyway. That says, flatness was a prison. That says what he did was liberation, was art, was the inevitable consequence of the universe's natural drive toward entropy and change. He builds an entire cosmology to retroactively justify the worst thing he ever did, And he has been building it and defending it and performing it and building it some more for however long he has existed. Think about what that costs across 1 trillion years. The maintenance of a self-justifying narrative that large. The constant, ongoing work of not looking at it directly, of redirecting every moment of almost recognition into another layer of rationalization. The axolotl, of all the entities in the show's mythology, is the one who seems to actually see this, who strips the performance down to its components and names them plainly. Grief, arson, lies told to the self long enough to feel like memory. There is a question embedded in his story that the show never fully answers, and probably doesn't intend to. Could Bill Cipher have been different? If someone had found him in the immediate aftermath of Euclidia, not 1 trillion years after, not when the patterns had calcified completely, but in the raw and formless period right after the loss of my bad. Could the grief have been processed rather than redirected? Could the being who had only ever wanted to share the beauty he could see before everything went catastrophically wrong have become something other than what he became? The Book of Bill doesn't give you a clean answer. The axolotl's poem doesn't give you a clean answer. The show characteristically gives you the information and leaves the weight of it with you to carry. He keeps the last surviving atoms of Euclidia in his hat. This detail from the Book of Bill is simultaneously absurd and devastating. After everything, after 1 trillion years of performance and chaos and deals and destruction, he cannot throw away the last atoms of his home. He cannot let go of what he destroyed. He carries it everywhere. He tells himself he burned his world to liberate it, tells himself that Euclidia was a prison of flat dreams that he set free. He has been telling himself this for longer than our civilization has existed. The chaotic indifference, the refusal to care about anything or anyone, the nihilism expressed through jokes and deals and constant motion, all of it reads differently once you know the origin. This is not a being who emerged from some primordial evil already fully formed. This is a being who did something catastrophic before he had either the wisdom or the emotional maturity to understand the full consequences, who lost everything he had ever known, and who then spent what may be approaching 1 trillion years refusing to sit with what he'd done, refusing to grieve, redirecting it all outward instead. The universe he operates in, for Bill, is not a place of value to be protected or people to be considered. It is a place of potential distraction, a place to be moved through at speed, always toward the next deal or scheme or sensation, never slowly enough to stop and feel the specific weight of what happened in Euclidia. The multiverse is his escape route, his endless trillion-year flight from a moment in a flat dimension that lasted maybe 30 seconds and cost everything. This is why he fixates so completely on Ford. It is why the partnership goes as deep as it does. Because Ford, working in the underground laboratory, is building the exit from this dimension, building the door that will let Bill through into a physical world where he can finally stop running in dimensional space and start running in the only other direction available. Action, chaos, the obliteration of every fixed structure that might, in its stability, remind him of what a stable world once felt like. When he finds Ford, when he looks at this brilliant, lonely, proud, deeply isolated scientist in his cave, Bill sees something specific. Another being who would rather lose everything than sit with what he's feeling. Another person for whom pride is armor against a wound that goes too deep to look at directly. He recognizes the shape of Ford's psychology because it rhymes with his own. He knows exactly how to approach it because he has been approaching it in himself for 1 trillion years. He doesn't make Ford brilliant. Ford was already brilliant. He makes Ford feel known, seen, special in the way that someone who has spent their whole life being different and excluded needs to feel seen. In the way that lowers every guard and produces complete and immediate trust without any of the checks you'd normally run. The horror of Bill Cipher is not that he is evil, it is that he is recognizable. He is grief we all know in some version, scaled up to cosmological proportions and pointed outward at the universe. He is what happens when loss goes unprocessed long enough to become a personality. The theraprism, where the Book of Bill ends with him confined, an interdimensional rehabilitation center outside of space and time, where he is supposed to sit with exactly what he has been running from, is, in the context of his story, both fitting and genuinely frightening. Because sitting with what you've done, really sitting with it without deflecting or denying or escaping, is harder than any external consequence could ever be. He keeps the atoms of Euclidia in his hat. He carries them because he cannot let them go, and maybe that, in the end, is the most human thing about him. Story 3. Two Boys at the Beach. Stan and Ford. Before everything fell apart. Every tragedy has a before, a time when the thing that fell hadn't fallen yet, when the crack that would eventually open into a chasm was still almost invisible, barely there. For Stanley and Stanford Pines, the twin brothers whose estrangement and eventual reunion forms the emotional spine of the entire show. The before is Glass Shard Beach, New Jersey, sometime in the early 1960s. Two boys on a stretch of unremarkable coastal shoreline, building a boat, making promises, being brothers in the uncomplicated way that only exists before the world starts insisting you become something specific. The beach itself is already a clue about the family. Glass Shard Beach. Not a beautiful name, not a name that suggests privilege or ease. A beach named for something sharp and ordinary and slightly dangerous. The Pines family lived there because it was what they could afford. Philbrick Pines ran a pawn shop, that most unglamorous of businesses, and Corinne Pines, whose maiden name was Romanoff, had worked as a fortune teller before marriage. Working class in the way of families, where money is never quite enough, and where the awareness of its absence is a constant low-level static in every room of the house. Philbrick was a hard man, not actively cruel in the theatrical way of fiction, but hard in the particular way of men who calibrated their love to usefulness, who expressed care through expectation rather than warmth, whose approval was never not contingent on something. You learned what mattered in Philbrick's house by learning what disappointed him. Failure was communicated clearly. Success was expected and therefore unremarkable. The show gives you just enough of Philbrick to understand the architecture of the twins' psychology without making him a villain in the simple sense. He is not monstrous. He is disappointing in the ordinary human way, a man whose own difficulties hardened into a philosophy before he had children, and who then parented out of that philosophy without questioning whether it was right or fair or producing the results he actually wanted. He wanted useful sons. He got one brilliant son who became a world-class scientist and one charming son who became a small-time scammer. And the split between them was caused in part by the environment he created, and in part by the accident of temperament, and in part by a breaking model in a science fair that nobody meant to break. That is life rather than story. Real harm is usually less theatrical than fiction wants it to be. It is usually one hard man and one unanswered silence and one teenage boy standing on a road with nowhere to go. Stan understood this early and navigated it instinctively. He developed the con man's primary skill, reading a room, identifying what people needed to hear, adjusting his presentation accordingly, as a survival mechanism inside his own family before he ever used it on anyone outside of it. He was charming in the way that children who grow up in difficult environments are often charming. Not naturally exactly, but strategically, the charm a tool that eventually grew into genuine warmth. He was not as academically gifted as his twin. He had made his peace with it, or was in the process. Ford went in the opposite direction, finding his father's regard largely unavailable, because the currency Philbrick valued, the practical kind, was not what Ford naturally produced. Ford retreated into a world his father couldn't follow. Mathematics, physics, the study of anomalies, of things that didn't fit the expected pattern. He had 6 fingers on each hand from birth, polydactyly, and the children at school never let him forget it. A physical marker of difference, visible and weird, something that made him a target. Stan protected him. This is the most important fact about their relationship before everything went wrong. Stan protected Ford. Not because he was asked to, not because Ford was more beloved or more worth protecting, but because the threat to his brother registered as a threat to himself. Protecting Ford was the thing Stan was best at in a world that didn't offer him many arenas where he was best at things. They found a boat in an enclosed cove on the beach. Battered, half-rotted, the name Stan O'Wars painted on the side in letters that had faded but not disappeared. They decided together, with the total certainty of 12-year-olds and no understanding of practical obstacles, that they would fix it up and sail away on it. Around the world, away from the pawn shop, away from Glass Shard Beach and everything the name implied. They were going to be free of all of it. The boat is one of those details the show plants early and returns to at the end, and the return hits harder because of how much time has passed between planting and payoff. When Stan and Ford finally sail away together in the series finale, older men with the full weight of their shared history between them, the boat now called the Stan O'War II, the image reaches back through the entire series to those two boys in the cove and the promise they made there. The show is saying they kept it, 60 years late and at enormous cost to both of them, but they kept it. But before that, before any of that resolution and healing and the ocean ahead of them. The science fair. Ford's model was extraordinary. His teachers recognized it. One of them, seeing something in Ford's work that went beyond ordinary student achievement, encouraged him to apply for a scholarship to West Coast Tech, a prestigious university, the kind of opportunity that doesn't come to boys from pawnshop families on beaches named for broken glass. The scholarship application required a working model of the device to be presented to the judging panel. Ford submitted it. He was accepted, conditional on the model surviving intact until judging. Stan knocked it over. Not in anger, not deliberately, in the way that things happen between brothers who live in close quarters and are always half fighting about something and are not, at 12, particularly careful about the physical space they occupy. The model fell. The model broke. The scholarship was gone. Philbrick Pines reacted with the certainty of a man who had been looking for a specific confirmation and found it. He had always known which son was the asset and which son was the liability. This was proof. He told Stan he had stolen from the family, that he was worthless, that he needed to go and not come back until he could replace what he'd taken. He threw his teenage son out of the house. He did this in front of Ford. Ford said nothing. There are 100 reasons he might have said nothing. Shock, guilt, the paralysis of watching something terrible happen too quickly to respond to. None of the reasons are sufficient. The silence is the beginning of everything. Ford's inability to stand up for Stan in that moment is the crack that becomes the chasm. And Ford knew it. He knew it then, in the instant it happened, and he knew it for the rest of his life. Think about what it is to carry that kind of specific silence. Not a general regret, not the vague guilt of having been imperfect in various unmemorable ways, but a single specific moment fully preserved, a moment where the thing you should have done was completely clear, and you did not do it, and you watched your brother walk out the door and you said nothing. You carry that the way you carry something with a particular shape, something with edges that catch on you at unexpected angles when you're not watching. When you wake up at 3 in the morning and the defenses are down and the memory finds you. Ford went to backups more and became brilliant in the particular way that people become brilliant when brilliance is their only viable path to anything. He published. He won awards. He was nationally recognized. He excelled in every measurable external dimension. And he was lonely in the specific way that people who have built their entire identity around their intellect are often lonely. Not unable to interact with others, not incapable of warmth, but somehow always slightly apart from any room they're in. Always slightly more comfortable with problems than with people. Always a little uncertain, underneath the credentials and the achievements, about whether the thing that made him worth knowing was who he was or what he could do. Stan was elsewhere. Sleeping in the back of a car some nights, running small cons, selling something that wasn't quite what he'd said it was, making something that wasn't quite a legitimate deal seem like a legitimate deal, developing the repertoire of the low-stakes scammer through pure experience. Nothing glamorous, nothing stable. Moving from city to city with the instinct of someone who has been told they aren't welcome and has internalized that information as direction rather than injury. They didn't speak for years. There was no dramatic falling out, just the accumulating distance of two lives moving in opposite directions, and underneath it, the specific weight of a conversation that never happened. The acknowledgement neither of them made. The moment that both of them probably replayed differently depending on the year and the hour and how much they'd had to drink. The moment that meant different things to each of them without either of them saying so. What Ford eventually sent, when his life in Gravity Falls had deteriorated to the point where he needed someone he could trust absolutely. What Ford sent was not a reconciliation. It was an instruction. He needed Stan to come and hide the first journal somewhere it would never be found. That was all. Not the reunion Stan had been waiting for. Not the acknowledgement of what had been lost between them. Just another request for a service. Stan came anyway, because Stan always came when Ford needed him. And the fight that followed, the explosion of years of accumulated resentment and grief and the specific pain of a person who loves someone and cannot make that person see them clearly, ended with the portal activated and Ford falling through it and the machine breaking and Stan standing alone in the silence after. He was in his late 20s, maybe his early 30s, alone in his brother's underground laboratory with one journal and 30 years ahead of him. We will get to those 30 years in Story 6. But for now, 2 boys on a beach in New Jersey, a boat with a hopeful name, a promise that took 60 years to keep. This is where all of it begins. Not with demons or portals or cryptograms. With 2 kids and an old boat and the kinds of promises you make when you're 12 and you believe the ocean can take you anywhere. Story 4. The 6 years that built a monster. Ford's dark partnership with Bill Cipher Ford arrived in Gravity Falls in the mid-1970s, carrying $100,000 in grant money and the particular combination of excitement and loneliness that marks people who are genuinely brilliant and genuinely bad at being close to anyone. He had chosen this valley because his research indicated it was the single highest concentration of anomalous phenomena in the United States, possibly in the world. He built a lab in the forest. He hired Manly Dan to help with construction. He started filling journals. Creatures cataloged, phenomena described, measurements taken of the strange distortions in local physics that seemed to pervade the entire valley without emanating from any identifiable source. He was happy, in the way that solitary, driven people can be happy when the work is going exceptionally well, absorbed, productive, intellectually stimulated every single day, by a town that couldn't stop producing marvels. The first journal documents his early period in the valley with a breathless quality that you don't find in the later journals. It has the quality of a scientist who has spent his whole career working at the edge of the possible and has just found his way to a place where the edge moves. Where every morning brings something new. Where the ratio of questions to answers shifts. Not in the direction of greater certainty, but in the direction of greater wonder. He cataloged the gnomes and the multibear and the manitors and the gremloblin. He documented the properties of the floating cliffs and the chemistry of the water from the hot springs and the unusual behavior of the local deer population. He was having the time of his life. He eventually called in Fiddleford McGucket, his friend from Backupsmore. Fiddleford was a genius mechanic, someone who could build anything, who thought in physical structures the way Ford thought in mathematical abstractions. Their skills complemented each other almost perfectly. Ford provided the vision and the theoretical framework. McGucket provided the hands and the engineering instinct. They were, in the classic sense, a good team. For several years, this was enough. The research expanded, the journals grew. The catalog of Gravity Falls' supernatural population became increasingly comprehensive. But after 6 years, Ford hit a wall. He had documented the what of Gravity Falls with extraordinary thoroughness. He had not reached the why. The underlying cause of the valley's anomalous nature remained hidden. He could describe the effects in precise scientific detail. He couldn't explain the origin. He found a cave covered in ancient hieroglyphics, paintings and carved symbols left by the earliest inhabitants of the region, people who had known about the valley's strangeness for generations, who had developed a deep and careful relationship with it, who had left records. And among the symbols, Ford found an incantation, a set of words that, according to the accompanying imagery, would summon an entity of unlimited knowledge, an entity who could answer every question Ford had ever asked. The hieroglyphics also contained a warning. Very explicit, very clear. The carvings surrounding the incantation were unambiguous. Do not speak these words. Do not call this thing. Do not invite whatever this is into your mind. The people who had carved these warnings had looked at Bill Cipher, or something functionally identical to Bill Cipher, and said, "No, stay away. This path does not lead where you think it leads." Ford read the warning. He understood it. And then he spoke the incantation anyway. He later rationalized this in his journals with the particular logic of someone who has built their identity around being unusually intelligent. He was too clever to be deceived, too scientifically rigorous, too aware of his own cognitive processes to be manipulated in any significant way. He had spent his whole life being the smartest person in most rooms he'd occupied, and he had unconsciously mistaken that for a kind of invulnerability against all threats. But there are dangers against which intelligence is excellent armor. Bill Cipher did not attack Ford's intelligence. Bill had no need to. Ford's intellect was not a weakness Bill needed to overcome. It was a feature he intended to use. Bill didn't appear dramatically that night. That night, Ford went to sleep. And in the dream space between sleeping and waking, a yellow triangle in a top hat introduced himself. He told Ford he had been watching him, that he was impressed, that he was a muse, a being who chose one exceptional human mind every century to partner with, who had worked alongside the greatest thinkers in history, and who saw in Ford something he rarely saw. He told Ford that he was special in a way most people would never understand, that together, they could unlock the greatest mysteries in existence. Ford believed him. He wanted to believe it so completely that the distinction between wanting to believe something and actually believing it collapsed without him noticing. Because here, finally, after a lifetime of being the strange one, the six-fingered one, the too smart for the room one, the brother who had let Stan be thrown out without saying a word, here was something that seemed to see him fully, not as a function or a tool or an anomaly to be managed, as himself, as his best self, as the person he privately believed he could be if only someone sophisticated enough were looking. They worked together for years. Bill gave Ford genuine breakthroughs, real insights into the nature of the valley, assistance with problems that had resisted his best efforts. Under Bill's guidance, Ford developed the dimensional physics that would eventually lead to the portal's design. Under Bill's careful management of information, Ford never fully understood what the portal was actually for, what its completion would enable, what existed on the other side of the door he was building with his own hands. It is worth spending a moment on this because it is so easy to read it as extraordinary, so easy to place Ford's blindness in a category labeled supernatural threat, beyond the range of ordinary human vulnerability. But it wasn't. What Bill did to Ford was not exotic. It was the oldest form of manipulation in any tradition. He found a person who was fundamentally lonely, fundamentally unseen, fundamentally uncertain about whether the thing that made them valuable was their performance or their actual self. And he made that person feel chosen. Not just smart, chosen. Special in the way that cuts deepest, the way that addresses not the surface but the wound underneath the surface. Ford was brilliant. He had been told so his entire life. But being told you're brilliant and being told you are genuinely known, that someone sees you clearly and values specifically who you are rather than what you can produce, those are entirely different things. Brilliance without belonging is a cold kind of gift. And Bill, who had been watching human beings for a very long time, who understood loneliness the way someone who has survived incomprehensible amounts of it understands loneliness, knew exactly how to speak to the cold space in Ford that his research couldn't fill. For 6 years, Ford produced extraordinary work. The journals grew more sophisticated, the dimensional physics advanced by leaps. And in that same period, the portal took shape in the underground laboratory Ford had built beneath the valley floor, vast and humming and requiring all 3 journals to activate, a machine of tremendous power and no visible benign purpose, which Ford had told himself was a research instrument. The warning system Ford eventually installed in his own skull, the metal plate surgically implanted to prevent future dream state possession, represents the moment when the scales tipped. When he looked at what he'd been building and understood at last what it was for. The clarity of that moment must have been extraordinary and devastating in equal measure. 6 years of the most productive work of his life, and the productive work had been building a door for the exact kind of entity that every warning carved in ancient stone had told him not to invite in. McGucket saw it first. During the portal's first test activation, something went wrong, and Fiddleford was caught in the pull of it and briefly exposed to what existed on the other side. He glimpsed the nightmare realm. Maybe 1 second, maybe 2. Whatever he saw was enough to break something in him. He came to Ford and said, "Stop, I know what this is. I saw what's on the other side. This is not what we thought we were building." Ford told him he was wrong. Bill told Ford that McGucket had simply been frightened by something he wasn't equipped to understand. Ford believed Bill. McGucket quit. And in the weeks and months that followed, unable to sleep or eat or function, McGucket built the memory gun and began the long, catastrophic process of erasing himself. We'll come back to that in the next story. Ford continued alone. Until the moment, undated in the journals, the exact circumstances unclear, when he understood what he had been doing, what he had been building, who he had been building it for. The metal plate he had surgically installed in his own skull to prevent future possession. The invisible ink. The hidden journals. The conversion of his lab into a fallout shelter. The message sent to Stan. 6 years. 6 years during which a man who was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most intellectually capable human beings on the planet, was gently, systematically, comprehensively deceived. Not by attacking his intellect, but by appealing to his loneliness, his pride, his need to feel that someone genuinely exceptional recognized and valued his exceptional nature. That is not an exotic psychological manipulation. It is the most ordinary human vulnerability there is. And Ford, who could do dimensional physics in his head, never stood a chance against it. The most frightening aspect of the story is not the supernatural element. It is the human element. The warning in the cave said, "Stay away." The indigenous people who left that warning had seen what Ford was about to see, and they had known immediately. Ford ignored the warning because he believed he was different from whoever had left it. More capable. More intelligent. Above the danger, he was not above the danger. No one is above that particular danger. Because that particular danger is the one that comes for you specifically through the place where you feel most certain of your own strength. Story 5. The Man Who Forgot Himself. McGucket and the Memory Gun. The memory erasing gun that Fiddleford McGucket built was technically one of the most elegant pieces of engineering he ever produced. It worked exactly as designed. It worked reliably, consistently, without mechanical failure modes or unexpected complications. You pointed it at a person, activated the targeting sequence to isolate the specific memory you wanted removed, and the device extracted it cleanly, sealing it in a glass tube small enough to hold in your hand. The memory still existed, just no longer inside the person it had belonged to. The only problem was what happened to a human brain when you used it on yourself over and over for a decade. McGucket built it because of what he saw through the portal. He saw the nightmare realm, a dimension of pure chaos, a place with no consistent physics, no stable surfaces, no reliable light. An environment so fundamentally alien to the experience of being a person that the fraction of a second he was exposed to it produced trauma that didn't fade the way ordinary fear fades. It calcified. It became structural. Every time he closed his eyes, it was there. Every time he stopped actively occupying his mind with something else, it rushed back in to fill the space. The nightmare realm, in the show's mythology, is not merely a bad place. It is the absence of the conditions that make personhood possible. A physical world gives you consistent gravity, consistent matter, reliable cause and effect, the scaffolding that a self requires to function. The nightmare realm has none of this. It is literally made of chaos, and a human mind, adapted entirely for a universe where physics is reliable and surfaces are solid, and the same actions produce the same results. Encountering the nightmare realm is encountering the exact inverse of every assumption it was built on. It is, in a very real sense, an encounter with the impossibility of being a person, with the preconditions of selfhood simply removed. McGucket glimpsed this for maybe 2 seconds. 2 seconds of a dimension where nothing can be consistently itself, where the foundations of perception and thought and identity simply don't apply. And it marked him, permanently. Down to the base of his nervous system, where things can be marked that no amount of conscious processing or rational framework can reach. He built the gun because he needed the memory gone, not processed, not worked through. Gone. He used it on himself, and it worked. The memory of the nightmare realm was no longer inside him. He could sleep again. He felt, for the first time in weeks, like a recognizable version of himself. The relief was, he wrote later, like putting down a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. He used the gun again when the guilt about the portal became unbearable. He had helped build it. He had quit rather than stopping it, which felt, in retrospect, like washing his hands while the house burned. The guilt of insufficient action accumulated in him the way guilt always does, slowly, without announcement, becoming heavier than he could carry. So he erased it. But memories don't exist in isolation. They are woven through the fabric of everything else. They have context, earlier events that explain them, later events that respond to them, emotional associations that reach forward and backward through time. When you remove a specific memory, you don't just remove that event. You remove the thread connecting it to everything around it, and the surrounding memories lose structural integrity. They develop gaps, places where something clearly once was and is no longer. Gaps for McGucket needed to be filled. Because the absence of something you can feel the shape of, but not name, is its own kind of pain. So he erased the surrounding context. And then the context of the context and the process accelerated, the way these things always accelerate once the initial threshold has been crossed. Each use made the next use easier to justify. Each absence created new pressures that pointed back toward the same solution. He was building a feedback loop with a brain that was simultaneously the tool and the thing being operated on, and he didn't have enough remaining perspective to recognize what was happening until the damage was far enough advanced that recognition itself was compromised. He founded the Blind Eye Society in 1982, 17 days after building the gun, intending to offer other people the same relief he'd offered himself. The townspeople of Gravity Falls lived in a place where the supernatural was a daily reality. Gnomes, lake monsters, creatures in the woods, and had no framework for processing those encounters. McGucket offered them an exit. Come to the society. Tell us what you saw. Let us take it from you. Go home. Sleep. The society became its own institution. Members began using the gun on themselves not just for supernatural encounters, but for anything painful. Bad marriages, failed businesses, regrets carried too long. The gun was there, the relief it provided was real, and the human capacity for self-deception about when relief becomes avoidance is essentially limitless. What McGucket had built, with the best intentions and genuine compassion for his neighbor's suffering, was a machine for the elimination of accountability. The supernatural encounters were one thing. There's a genuine argument that forgetting you saw a gnome is a reasonable life choice in a town where gnomes exist and are not going anywhere. But the members of the society weren't just erasing the uncanny, they were erasing the difficult, the regrettable, the morally complicated. The things that, processed rather than removed, might have made them different people. Better people, possibly, or at minimum people who had actually sat with what they'd done and chosen a path forward. Instead, the path forward was simply to remove the obstacle. And over years and decades, the members of the Blind Eye Society became people shaped not by what they had experienced and processed, but by the accumulated absences of things removed. The gaps multiplied. The personality became porous. And the society, which had begun as a form of charity, became something much darker without anyone consciously deciding to make it so, which is exactly how most dark things become what they are. By the time Blind Ivan had taken over as the society's leader, and the organization had drifted far from its original charitable purpose, McGucket had lost so much of himself through accumulated damage that he was, to all external appearances, simply the town eccentric. The old man at the junkyard, the local kook, a figure of mild amusement and no particular significance to anyone in the town. What the members of the society did not know, what they would have had to have remembered to know, was that their unhinged, forgettable town eccentric was also the most gifted engineer the region had ever produced. Was the man who had built the device they all relied on. was, underneath the damage and the decades of accumulated absence where his memories used to be, still Fiddleford Hadron McGucket, a man of considerable intellectual stature who had once helped design an interdimensional portal and watched through its opening what should never be seen. There is something almost unbearably sad about McGucket's arc when you trace it from its beginning. He went to Gravity Falls because his friend Ford asked for his help, and he helped because he was good at helping, and what they built together was extraordinary, and he saw something through the portal that shattered his ability to function, and he built a device to fix that problem. And the device worked, and the fix expanded, and he kept applying it until the man who had arrived to help his friend was barely findable underneath all the things he'd taken from himself. The tragedy of Fiddleford McGucket is not dramatic. It is incremental. It is the tragedy of a series of individually understandable choices, each of which made a kind of sense in its moment, that accumulated without anyone's conscious intention into something that cost him nearly everything. When Dipper and Mabel and Seuss and Wendy recover his memories from the Hall of the Forgotten and play them back for him, when everything comes back at once, the entire load of everything he spent years erasing, landing on him in a single moment, the expression on his face is one of the most carefully observed pieces of animation in the entire show. It is not relief, it is not grief, it is the particular expression of a person encountering the full weight of who they are after a very long time away from themselves. He doesn't collapse under it. He stands up. He decides to carry it. That is, quietly and without fanfare, one of the bravest things anyone does in the entire show. To choose to remember. To pick up a history full of guilt and grief and failure and carry it forward. To refuse the relief of erasure and accept instead the harder work of being accountable to your own past. There is a version of McGucket's story that could be told as tragedy. The brilliant man undone by a single catastrophic exposure, the gifted engineer reduced to a figure of comic eccentricity, decades of a rich interior life simply missing, spent on the momentary relief of removal. And it is a tragedy in that reading. The loss is real. The damage is real. The years between the portal and the memory's recovery represent a gap in McGucket's experience of himself that cannot be refilled, only acknowledged as a gap. But the show doesn't ultimately read him as a tragedy because tragedy requires that the ending confirm the loss. And the ending, for McGucket, is not confirmation of loss. It's the opposite. He stands in the pyramid in the middle of Weirdmageddon, old and battered and still wearing the results of all the years of damage, and he builds the solution. He builds the machine that enables the Cipher wheel to function. His genius, which was buried under all the erasure and all the accumulated years of absence, was still there. Waiting. It never left. He just couldn't access it because he'd spent 30 years removing the context required to use it. The contrast with Bill Cipher, who carries his guilt as a performance while actually running from it at full speed, and with Stan, who carries his guilt productively but secretly, and with Ford, who tried to outthink his way past guilt and nearly destroyed the world. The contrast with all of the show's other approaches to the problem of what you do with what you've done. McGucket's answer, delivered quietly, is this. You remember it. You carry it. You don't erase it. There is something the show leaves deliberately unsaid in this contrast, but that becomes visible if you hold all four of them together at once. Bill erases through performance. Stan hides under performance. Ford rationalizes through intellectual framework. All three of these approaches are, in different ways, forms of avoidance. They all involve not quite looking at the thing directly. And all three of them come at enormous cost, to the self and to the people around them. McGucket, the one person who literally had a machine designed to erase, chose at the end to put it down. To look at the thing directly, to carry what he found when he looked. That is the most ordinary and the most difficult kind of courage in the entire mythology of the show, and it is almost entirely unannounced. Story 6, 30 Years in a Fez, The Long Loneliness of Stanley Pines. Picture the night the portal swallowed Ford. Stan is standing in his brother's underground laboratory. The fight is over. The portal has closed. Ford is gone. The room is quiet, in the specific way that rooms are quiet when something enormous has just happened in them, and the air hasn't finished registering it yet. The equipment hums, the lights are still on. The first journal is somewhere in this room. Stan is alone. He was in his late 20s or early 30s. He had nowhere to go and no particular reason to stay, and no qualifications for operating the machinery that filled the room around him. He had one journal. He didn't understand interdimensional physics. He hadn't spoken properly with his brother in years. He had just, in the heat of an argument that started as all their arguments did and ended worse than all their arguments ever had, pushed forward through a portal to another dimension and broken the machine. He could have walked away. Nothing was stopping him. He could have left the laboratory, gone back into the world, and let the mystery of Stanford Pines remain exactly that. He didn't leave. He assessed the situation with the part of his brain that has always been good at assessments, even when everything else is in chaos. He recognized that the portal needed 3 journals to activate, that he had one and the others were somewhere in the valley, and he decided, I will stay. I will find the journals. I will learn to operate this machine. I will bring Ford home. This was not a plan based on any realistic evaluation of his capabilities. It was the most irrational decision he ever made, and also, without question, the best. He converted the house into the Mystery Shack, partly for the income. He needed to eat, needed electricity, needed to keep the portal's systems running. But also for the cover story. A man living in Stanford Pines' house, calling himself Stanford Pines, running a tourist attraction. This is explainable. This is the kind of thing small Oregon towns accommodate without asking too many questions. The residents of Gravity Falls saw what they expected to see. An eccentric, borderline fraudulent fez-wearing uncle who was probably running some kind of minor scam. They were not wrong about any of the surface details. They were completely wrong about the reality underneath. Stan worked on the portal every morning before the shack opened. He worked on it late at night after it closed. He read Ford's technical notes until he understood them well enough to know what needed to happen, even if he didn't always understand why. He hired employees and let them believe they were working for a benign eccentric. He engaged with the town and maintained the performance of being Mr. Mystery, cheerful fraud, mild con man, nothing unusual here, with total and relentless commitment for 30 years. The thing that gets overlooked in the larger story is how genuinely hard that is. Not just the technical challenge of maintaining the portal across 3 decades without formal training in dimensional physics. The emotional challenge of what Stan had built the performance around. Every day he was living as his brother, wearing his name, his reputation, his identity, carrying the weight of having caused Ford's disappearance. Because the cause was the fight was real. The fall through the portal was not an accident in the way that requires no one to have done anything. It happened in a moment of physical conflict between 2 people who loved each other and had never, in all the years since Glass Shard Beach, fully cleared the air. Stan worked on the portal, knowing that when it opened, the person who came through might still be furious with him. Might look at 30 years of this and not see devotion, but see one more transgression stacked on top of all the others. He worked toward a reunion that he had no guarantee would be a reunion in the warm sense. He worked toward the possibility of being held accountable for everything. And he kept working anyway. Seuss was 12 when Stan hired him. Stan had been doing this alone for over a decade by then. Seuss had no father. His father had left, sent postcards on birthdays with empty promises of visiting that never materialized. Seuss came looking for a summer job and met Stan, who was gruff and demanding and sharp-tongued, and also, underneath all of that, a person who noticed a 12-year-old without a father and understood, without needing to be told, what that meant. Stan gave Seuss a job and a place to belong. Seuss gave Stan something Stan probably needed more than he could have admitted. Someone who was simply, straightforwardly glad he existed. The thing about the con man's craft is that it requires you to suppress your own authentic response to everything and replace it with the response that serves the performance. Stan had been running this particular con for so long that the suppression had become seamless and invisible, even to himself. There were probably moments, probably many of them, in the quiet hours of the late nights in the basement, When the portal hummed and the house was still and the journal was open on the workbench. When the performance dropped. When the weight of it came back in. When the loneliness of 30 years of keeping this secret was simply there without any con man's armor to redirect it. We don't see those moments. The show keeps them off camera because Stan would keep them off camera. But they were there. They had to be. No one carries something this heavy for 30 years without feeling the weight. For 30 years, no one in Gravity Falls knew who Stan actually was. No one knew what was under the shack. No one knew what he was building, what he was working toward, what the actual purpose of all the long hours in the locked basement was. He was, in every external sense, exactly what he appeared to be. A minor league scammer running a tourist trap in a small town in Oregon. But every morning, before the shack opened, he went down into the basement and worked on the portal. Every morning for 30 years. That is one of the most profound acts of love in the entire history of animated television. And it was being performed invisibly, without witness, without acknowledgement, without anyone knowing it was happening. The show spends 2 seasons keeping it hidden, letting you think Stan is something other than what he is. And then it shows you, all at once, what the performance and the scams and the fez were built on top of. And it is not a twist. It is a portrait. It is the show saying, this is what love actually looks like sometimes. Not the announced kind, the kind that works quietly in a basement for 30 years without telling anyone. The memory wipe at the end, when Stan sacrifices his own mind to kill Bill from within, when he offers to lose everything rather than let Ford and the kids and the town and the world be lost. That is the culmination of 30 years of a man spending everything he had for someone he loved. The mechanism requires Ford to understand, requires Stan to stand there and explain. I am going to offer Bill my mind, and when he enters it, you are going to use the memory gun on me. Everything will be gone. I will not remember Ford or the kids or Gravity Falls or the portal or any of it. I will not remember the 30 years. And Ford, who spent 6 years being deceived by a being far more sophisticated than any human adversary, who has been through the nightmare realm and come back and stood against chaos demons and survived situations that should not have been survivable. Ford hesitates. Not because he doesn't understand the plan, because he understands what it is costing Stan to offer it, because he has spent 30 years in another dimension thinking about a silence he couldn't undo. And now his brother is standing in front of him offering to forget him entirely as the price of saving the world. And Ford would like very much, if this were not the required price. Stan doesn't waver. He says, just do it, with the particular flatness of someone who has made a decision and is not open to discussion about it. The same flatness, probably, with which he made the original decision 30 years earlier, standing alone in the laboratory after the portal closed, when he could have left and didn't. When he assessed the situation and decided what needed to happen and got on with it. The recovery of his memories through Mabel's scrapbook, through Waddles jumping onto his lap, through the slow return of everything he'd given up. That is the show's gentlest and most devastating grace note. The scrapbook is such a Mabel solution. Not a technical fix, not a scientific procedure, not a formal reversal of the memory wipe. Just pictures and words and the assembled evidence of a summer that was worth remembering, offered to a man who has forgotten everything and asked to remember. Come back. Here's what you lost. Here's who you were. We kept it for you. He gets it back. He gets all of it back. And then he and Ford get in the boat. The Stano War II, the boat they'd promised each other when they were boys on Glass Shard Beach in New Jersey. Old men with a lifetime of history between them. Finally living the plan they'd made when they had nothing but time and each other and the whole ocean ahead of them. Story 7. The Child Who Wasn't Innocent. The true story of Lil Gideon. Gideon Gleeful is introduced as a joke. He is a parody of televangelists. Hirsch has confirmed the character is based primarily on the real-world televangelist Benny Hinn, a chubby, white, pompadoured child in a baby blue suit who speaks in a theatrical southern drawl and runs a tourist attraction called the Ten of Telepathy, where he performs fake psychic acts for the credulous residents of Gravity Falls. He is played for laughs from his very first scene. He is meant to be ridiculous. And then he tries to murder Dipper Pines with a pair of lamb shears. The bolo tie is a mystic amulet drawn from Journal 2. It gives him real telekinesis. Ford's journal notes that the amulet, used for extended periods, corrupts the soul of the wearer and whitens the hair. Gideon's signature white pompadour is not a genetic quirk or an affectation. It is the visible evidence of extended contact with a soul-corrupting supernatural artifact. He has been wearing it since some point in his early childhood. His father, Bud Gleeful, is soft, well-meaning, fundamentally not equipped to handle what his son has become. A car salesman at heart, a decent man with a big smile who cannot bring himself to say no. His mother has been reduced, over the course of Gideon's life, to a traumatized, nervous wreck. Gideon frightens her. He treats both of his parents as instruments of his will rather than as people. And he has been doing this for long enough that they have lost the capacity to push back meaningfully. How does a 10-year-old develop this kind of dominance over the adults responsible for him? The picture the show implies is recognizable. A child with unusual ability, the supernatural telekinesis, yes, but also the entirely human capacity to identify what people need to hear and deploy charm with surgical precision. Discovers early that the adults around him are manageable. Discovers that fear is more reliable than love as a motivator. Discovers that charm and threat in combination are nearly unstoppable against people who are already predisposed to give you what you want. Add the amulet. Add the journal's notation that extended use corrupts the soul. Add however many years of a childhood in which every desire was met with either capitulation or the kind of negligible resistance easily overcome. And you get Lil Gideon. A 10-year-old who has developed the manipulation skills of someone 3 times his age and the emotional regulation of someone much younger, because emotional regulation only develops when you're allowed to encounter the experience of not getting what you want. And Gideon has rarely had that experience. What prevents him from being simply a cartoon villain, what makes him genuinely interesting, is his relationship with Mabel. His feelings for Mabel Pines are not manufactured. There is nothing strategic about the obsessive, catastrophic attachment he develops for her the moment they meet. He genuinely loves her, in the way that someone who has never developed a healthy understanding of what love requires. Loves someone totally, possessively, without any comprehension that love which doesn't allow for the other person's refusal is something other than love. He does not understand that Mabel's no means no. Not because he was raised to believe that refusals don't matter, or not only because of that, but because Gideon has been raised in an environment where no rarely meant no when he wanted something badly enough. The adults around him have consistently modeled that sufficient pressure eventually produces the desired result. He applies this model to Mabel and finds, repeatedly, catastrophically, that she is immune to it. Prison does something unexpected to him. The inmates of Gravity Falls Maximum Security Prison love his psychic act and make him their leader. He becomes, essentially, the capo of a prison gang, which is so absurd it functions as pure comedy. But it also reveals something true about Gideon. He is a leader, has always been a leader. The impulse toward power and hierarchy and command was always there, was always going to find its expression somewhere. The question has always only been, in service of what? There's something worth sitting with in that observation, because it applies to a lot of the characters in this show. The traits that make Gideon dangerous are the same traits, redirected, that could make him genuinely good at something. Charisma, pattern recognition in other people's needs, the ability to generate loyalty through presence and performance, the drive to be the one in charge of whatever room he walks into. None of these are inherently bad things. All of them can go either way depending on the soil they're planted in. Gideon grew up in soil that produced fear-based obedience and modeled manipulation as love. His father's soft capitulation taught him that persistence overrides refusal. His mother's terror of him confirmed that he was more powerful than the people responsible for him. The amulet arrived and did exactly what the amulet does. Took what was already there and amplified it, pushed it in the direction it was already heading, accelerated the corruption that had been underway for years. When Weirdmageddon comes and Bill breaks him out of prison and offers him the fantasy, all of eternity to convince Mabel to love him, the power of the apocalypse backing his courtship, Gideon faces the distillation of who he has been his whole life. He can continue being this. He can take the power being offered and use it the way he's always used power, to get what he wants regardless of whether it's his to have. And then Dipper stands in front of him and says the truth that no one had ever said clearly enough to land. You cannot force someone to love you. And if you could, what you got at the end of it wouldn't be love. It would be compliance, which is not the same thing. Gideon knows this already on some level, has probably always known it, in the same way that people who pursue power as a substitute for genuine connection know, underneath the pursuit, what they're actually hungry for. The knowing doesn't automatically produce change. Change requires a choice in a specific moment, with the wrong thing being significantly easier and more available than the right thing. Gideon lets them go. He defies Bill, knowing what that means, because the alternative is being the thing he's always been, and he has decided in this moment that he doesn't want to be that thing anymore. It is not a full redemption arc. He is not good by the end of it. But he has made one right choice in a situation where the wrong choice was significantly easier, and that is where character change actually begins. Not in dramatic declarations, but in single moments of choosing differently when it would have been much simpler not to. He was 10 at the beginning. He was 12 at the end. Some journeys take a whole life. Some start with one choice in the middle of an apocalypse that nobody planned on surviving. The white hair tells a story no one thinks to ask about. Every person who looks at Gideon Gleeful sees the signature white pompadour and reads it as a style choice, as an affectation, as the deliberate theatrics of a child who wants to look older and more commanding than he is. Nobody sees the journal notation. Nobody connects the hair to the amulet. Nobody in the town of Gravity Falls, with its long history of looking at the surface of things and not looking underneath, sees a 10-year-old boy whose hair has been whitened by the spiritual cost of wearing a corrupting, supernatural artifact since before he was old enough to understand what corruption meant. He has been paying a price nobody named for him. He will be paying it long after the amulet is gone. Story 8. Shifty, the monster who was a pet. The tragedy of experiment. 210. There is something Ford Pines does when he becomes genuinely attached to something, visible in his journals if you know to look for it. He gives it a nickname. The Shapeshifter. Experiment 210, the creature he discovered as an egg during the excavation of his underground bunker, Ford called, in his most private and unguarded journal entries, Shifty. The official scientific designation was clinical and distancing, as scientific designations are meant to be. But the nickname tells you everything about how Ford actually related to the creature before things went wrong. There was a period, early in Shifty's life in the bunker, that Ford documented with a warmth that reads more like a proud owner than a careful scientist. The creature communicated through transformation before it developed language, becoming a dog when happy, a sea urchin when sad. Ford noted this with what is clearly delight, thinly disguised under the vocabulary of scientific observation. The entries from this period have a particular quality. Ford, who is usually exhaustive in his documentation of scientific detail and sparse in his documentation of his own emotional state, becomes slightly more expansive when writing about Shifty. He notes, with what reads like reluctant amusement, that the creature appears to have developed a preference for watching Ford work. That it takes the form of a small chair when it wants Ford to sit down, which Ford interprets as the creature having developed a proprietary interest in its caretaker's rest schedule. That it refuses to eat from any bowl other than the blue one with the chipped edge, which Ford calls fastidious in the neutral language of scientific observation, and which is transparently the note of a man who finds this charming. He was attached. The journals document the attachment even as they try to maintain the scientific frame around it. This matters because it changes the character of the eventual freezing, the moment when Ford's judgment about the creature's danger finally overcame his attachment to it. He didn't freeze Shifty because he didn't care. He froze Shifty because he cared and was still afraid. And the fear won, and the freezing happened, and then Ford fell through the portal, and the bunker sat sealed. And no one knew any of this existed. McGucket's recommendation from the moment the egg hatched had been to freeze the creature immediately as a test of the bunker's cryogenic chambers. The creature was extraordinary, and extraordinary things are dangerous. This was functionally and practically the correct recommendation, but Ford kept it instead. Fed it canned beans from McGucket's extensive stockpile of barren num-nums high fly-in beans. Showed it photographs of animals to map the range of its abilities. Gave it progressively more information about the world, while telling himself, in the way that people tell themselves things they are motivated to believe, that his very secure cage would absolutely hold. The creature grew more intelligent faster than Ford's assumptions had accounted for. It developed language. It watched Ford and McGucket with increasing attention, cataloging not just their appearances but their behaviors, their habits, the specific texture of their interactions. It was studying them the way they were studying it. And what it wanted, what it had always been going to want eventually, was access to the journals, access to more forms, access to the full catalog of shapes that existed in Ford's documentation of gravity falls. Ford refused. He understood, as an abstract matter, that a creature with the ability to become anything it had ever seen should probably not be shown a comprehensive guide to everything dangerous in the supernatural zone. But he had told it no so many times, and the creature was so clearly intelligent, and the cage was very secure. It waited until it understood Ford's relationship with McGucket well enough to impersonate McGucket convincingly. It staged an escape from its cage while Ford was away. It tied the real Fiddleford in a closet, and it became McGucket, not just his appearance, but his voice, his mannerisms, the exact hesitant quality of his speech when he was about to tell Ford something Ford didn't want to hear. It waited for Ford to return. It initiated a conversation about the journals. Ford caught the impersonation because of something small, a detail of gesture perhaps, or a word choice slightly off from the real Fiddleford's usage. The confrontation was brief and brutal. The creature was lured into a trap, a decoy journal placed where it would find it, a cryogenic chamber nearby, the door sealed before it could escape. Ford froze it, sealed the bunker, walked away. The portal project was never completed the way they intended. Ford fell through the activated portal during the fight with Stan. McGucket used the memory gun until he'd forgotten everything. The bunker sat sealed in the forest with the cryogenic systems running on aging equipment that was never maintained because no one knew it existed. And at some point, no one knows when, Experiment 210 broke free of stasis and found itself alone in a sealed underground facility with no exits, no images to copy, no forms to take, and nothing but time. Think about what that is for a creature whose entire mode of being is expressed through transformation. The shapeshifter's nature is to be other things, to take on forms, to adapt and change and become whatever the context requires. In the sealed bunker, there is no context. There is nothing to become. There are walls and old equipment and the dark. 30 years of that. Not the productive solitude that creative people sometimes choose, not the meditative quiet of a retreat, not any kind of darkness chosen or accepted. Just the dark of a sealed room and the low mechanical hum of aging cryogenic systems, and no information arriving from anywhere. No new forms, no new data, no mirrors, and nothing to become. The question the cryptogram asks, am I me? Is he me? Takes on a different quality when you sit with it long enough. Because for most beings, identity is constructed in relationship to the world. You know what you are because of how you interact with everything around you, because of the continuous feedback loop of being in contact with reality and being confirmed as yourself by that contact. Remove the contact, remove the feedback, remove the world. What is left of the self? For an entity that has no fixed form, the question is not rhetorical. It is genuinely, practically pressing in a way that it perhaps is not for a creature with a stable body, a face that looks the same in every reflection, a voice that sounds like itself and no one else. Experiment 210 had no stable form. It was composed entirely of the forms it had copied. Alone in the dark, with no new forms available, what it had to work with was what it had already been. All the shapes accumulated before the sealing, cycles of repetition in an endless loop. Ford's face and McGucket's face and the canned bean mascot, and the sea urchin and the dog. It became when it was happy, cycling through them in the dark with no one watching and no particular reason to choose any one of them over any other. When Dipper and Wendy find it, when it takes the form of a bean can mascot and very nearly succeeds in its ruse to steal the journal, the desperation underneath the manipulation is palpable if you're looking for it. It wants the journal because the journal contains forms it has never seen. It has been alone in the dark for decades with nothing but its own white formlessness. The journal represents everything it needs. Of course, it's willing to do nearly anything to get it. Ford never went back for it. Nothing in any of the published material suggests Ford felt guilt about this, which might itself be the evidence of guilt, given how careful and precise his scientific notation becomes when he is documenting things he's uncomfortable confronting directly. Shifty is frozen again at the end of the episode, refrozen in Dipper's form because it grabbed for that shape in the chaos and was caught in it when the stasis activated. Frozen in someone else's face, wearing a form that isn't its own. Waiting again. And the show never tells you whether Ford knew, when he froze Shifty the second time, whether he understood that the creature he'd named had been alone down there for decades and was asking, through every act of desperation and manipulation, to be seen. Not just studied, seen. The show doesn't answer this because the show trusts you to carry the question. The shapeshifter is still down there somewhere, presumably, in the bunker in the forest, and the valley above it carries on as it always has, strange and beautiful and crackling with the energy of a spacecraft buried millions of years below, completely indifferent to the creature sealed in the dark at its roots, asking in the silence the question that no one has stayed long enough to answer. Story 9. The Bell, the Curse, and What It Cost to Be. A Northwest. Pacifica's hidden story. You remember the bell. If you've seen the episode, you cannot forget it. It is one of those moments in a children's television show that hits completely differently depending on how old you are when you encounter it. And differently again every subsequent time as you grow older and your vocabulary for what you're watching expands. Pacifica Northwest is trying to say something to her father. The specific words don't matter. What matters is that she is attempting to exercise some small measure of agency in her relationship with the adult responsible for her well-being. She is 12 years old. She has an opinion. She is trying to express it. Her father reaches into his pocket. A small bell sounds. And Pacifica stops. Immediately. Completely. Mid-sentence, mid-thought, mid-impulse. Her expression doesn't shift. She doesn't flinch or hesitate. She simply falls into compliance smoothly and automatically as if resistance had never been on the menu at all. And then the moment passes, and Preston Northwest keeps talking, and the show moves on. If you watched it at 12, you probably processed it as Pacifica's dad is kind of mean and also weird. If you watched it as an adult with any familiarity with behavioral psychology, or with certain kinds of family dynamics that get discussed in specific kinds of therapy offices, the bell landed differently. The bell was not a small detail. The bell was the entire architecture of Pacifica's life communicated in 2 seconds of screen time. Pavlov's conditioning experiments established that if you repeatedly pair a neutral stimulus with a meaningful consequence, the stimulus alone eventually produces the response. Preston Northwest had applied this principle to his 12-year-old daughter. He had spent her entire childhood pairing the bell with whatever consequence he used to enforce compliance. And the show implies, through Dipper's journal entry about the family, that those consequences included not just social and financial punishments, but potentially physical ones as well. He had conditioned obedience into her so thoroughly and for so long that the conditioning had become invisible to everyone, including Pacifica herself. The most frightening part of this is the invisibility. Pacifica doesn't know she's been conditioned. You can't know from the inside of a pattern that has been applied to you since before you had language to describe it, that the pattern exists. You think it's just who you are. You think the reflexive compliance is your own personality. You think that the immediate collapse inward when you try to push back is just how you work, just some internal limitation you've always had. You don't have a memory of yourself before the conditioning because the conditioning started before memory works the way memory works later. before self-consciousness was developed enough to notice what was being done. She has been shaped, carefully, systematically, by someone who knew exactly what he was doing and why, into a particular silhouette. Into the Northwest daughter, poised, compliant, impeccably performed, never wrong-footed in public, never stepping outside the lines of what benefits the family. Into a 12-year-old who wins the most popular award every year at the end of summer party, who never says anything genuine in public because genuine things are unpredictable and unpredictability is not permitted, who smiles at everyone from behind a face that is not quite her face. The Northwest family's wealth and status in Gravity Falls rests on a lie. Nathaniel Northwest, Pacifica's supposed great-great-grandfather and the claimed founder of the town, was a fraud. The real founders of Gravity Falls were a different group entirely, and the Northwest family arranged for this history to be buried, for the official records to be falsified, for the story of Nathaniel Northwest as civic hero to be told and retold until it was indistinguishable from fact. The lumberjack ghost haunting the Northwest mansion is named Archibald Corduroy, connecting him to Wendy's family, the Corduroys, who have been in Gravity Falls for generations. Archibald was a real person who was hired by the Northwests and promised, in writing, with a handshake, in the presence of witnesses, that the common people of Gravity Falls would be allowed into the Northwest mansion once every 100 years in exchange for his labor. He built the mansion. The promise was not kept. He died, betrayed, and spent the next 100 years as a vengeful ghost haunting the building, waiting for the Northwest to finally honor the one commitment they had made. The show doesn't belabor the political content of this story. It doesn't turn it into a lecture. It presents it with the same dry precision it presents everything. Here is what happened. Here are the people involved. Here are the consequences that followed from a broken promise. Here is who paid the price. And it lets you sit with the observation that the people who built Pacifica's world literally built the mansion she lives in, literally laid the foundation of the reputation she's been conditioned to protect, were paid with a lie. Every bell, every time Preston Northwest reached into his pocket, and the sound rang out and Pacifica's sentence stopped mid-syllable. Every piece of her personhood that was conditioned out of her in the service of maintaining a family name that should not have been her burden to maintain because it was built on fraud. All of it is connected. The conditioning in service of protecting something that, if she knew its full history, she might not choose to protect at all. This is what Pacifica has been shaped to protect. And the show asks, quietly and without announcing the question too loudly, whether Pacifica was ever asked. Whether anyone ever sat down with the girl who could not finish a sentence without a bell, stopping her and asked, "Given all of this, knowing what you now know, is this who you want to be? Is this what you want to spend your life defending?" The moment when Pacifica decides to pull the lever, when she decides to open the gates of the mansion and let the common folk in and break the curse, is one of the show's finest pieces of writing, because of how completely it understands what it is asking her to do. Her father is ringing the bell. The conditioning is firing. Every reflex she has ever developed in 12 years of being a Northwest is telling her to comply, to fall in line, to preserve the family's interests and her own safety. She pulls the lever anyway. And the lumberjack ghost, Archibald Corduroy, dissolving into peaceful light after 100 years of waiting, looks at her and says, "You're not like the others. You've broken the pattern." The ending image is small and almost comedic. Pacifica walking behind her furious parents, deliberately stepping on their favorite carpet with her muddy shoes. A tiny private act of defiance, not earth-shattering, not dramatic, just deliberate, intentional. Choosing to mark the thing her parents told her was sacred with proof that she was there and she chose differently, and it survived being marked. There is something important in the mundane smallness of that final image. The show could have given Pacifica a sweeping declaration, a dramatic confrontation, a speech. It chose instead to give her mud on an expensive carpet, the most intimate and private kind of rebellion, the kind that costs very little externally but means everything internally. Because the work of becoming yourself after years of being shaped into someone else doesn't begin with speeches. It begins with a single moment of doing the small thing you were told not to do and finding out that you survived it, that the house didn't fall, that your parents' disappointment when it arrived was survivable in a way you'd always been told it wouldn't be. It is the beginning of the work, not the work itself, just the beginning. The first genuine exercise of a muscle that has been conditioned for 12 years to remain inactive. The show never pretends that beginning is the same as completion. We don't see Pacifica's full transformation because transformations of this depth don't happen in one episode. They happen over years, in decisions large and small, in the gradual and patient process of discovering that you are allowed to be something other than what you were trained to be. The bell is still in her father's pocket. The conditioning doesn't reverse because a chaos demon was defeated. The work of undoing what was done to Pacifica Northwest is not over at the end of the episode. It has barely begun. But she has started. And starting, when the conditioning runs as deep as hers does, is an extraordinary thing to have done. Story 10. The show that escaped into the world. The real Cipher hunt. On February 15, 2016, Gravity Falls ended. The series finale aired on Disney XD and was watched by approximately 2.5 million households, making it the most watched telecast in the history of the network. And at the very end, after all the resolution and the warmth and the careful, loving completion of every storyline the show had spent 2 seasons building, after the theme played in its softest and most deliberately nostalgic arrangement, there was one final thing. A single shot. Not animation. Real footage. A live-action stone statue sitting in a shaft of forest light, partially covered in moss, the triangular form and top hat and single enormous eye, unmistakably Bill Cipher. Real, physical, tangible. Sitting somewhere in the world. And then a cryptogram, using the same cipher system the show had been training its audience to decode for 4 years. When decoded, the message spoke of buried treasure, a statue beyond rusty gates, something waiting deep in the woods. Alex Hirsch had been planning this for over a year. He had commissioned a prop sculptor named Fawn Davis, a fabricator who worked on film productions and appeared on the television show BattleBots, to build a full-scale, weatherproof plexiglass statue of Bill Cipher. They had rubbed the statue with glue mixed with plant seeds so it would grow real moss and look as if it had been standing outdoors for years. Hirsch had driven to Reedsport, Oregon, a small coastal community of about 4,000 people, made an arrangement with a local landowner, and installed the statue deep in the forest on private property. He had taken a few seconds of footage, inserted it into the finale as the show's very last image, and then waited. For 5 months after the finale aired, he said nothing publicly. Fans speculated. The footage was clearly real footage. Something was out there. But where? On July 20th, 2016, Hirsch posted 3 words on Twitter. Are you ready? And then the first clue. Not in Oregon. In a cathedral in St. Petersburg, Russia. He had, in the months following the finale, traveled to conventions and events and personally hidden clues in physical locations around the world. In Russia, in Japan and California, in Oregon, at roadside attractions in public parks, and amusement parks. Some clues existed only in digital form, encoded in images posted to social media. Each one required the cipher skills the show had been teaching its audience since 2012, and each one pointed to a physical location where the next clue was waiting. The fandom mobilized immediately. Fans in Russia found the St. Petersburg clue. Fans in Japan found the clue hidden there. Fans in Los Angeles drove to Griffith Park at odd hours to search the base of a statue of Griffith J. Griffith, a man whose first name was his last name, as the clue cryptically noted, for a hollow standpine's head containing a message in invisible ink that required blacklight to read. Fans assembled a 2,000-piece puzzle in a collective online effort spread across multiple platforms, photographing fragments, building a shared digital image, solving it in roughly 48 hours. There was a geocache hidden beneath a lawn gnome in Portland, Oregon. It contained a Viewmaster device with slides showing images of Confusion Hill, a gravity-defying roadside attraction in Northern California that had been one of the real-world inspirations for the Mystery Shack. Jason Ritter, the voice of Dipper Pines, happened to be near the next clue location in Los Angeles and joined fans live on camera to search for it. The line between the show and the people who loved it had never been thinner. 13 clues over 13 days, spanning multiple continents, requiring people on opposite sides of the world to collaborate in real time, sharing cipher keys and coordinating physical searches and building the kind of temporary community that forms around a shared, time-limited goal, and then disperses when the goal is complete but leaves something behind in everyone who participated. The coordination required was extraordinary in scale. Fans in one time zone were working while fans in another were asleep, handing off progress like a relay baton. One group decodes the cipher, another drives to the physical location, another posts photographs of what they find. Multiple Discord servers and Reddit threads and Twitter feeds running simultaneously, each tracking a different thread of the hunt, all converging toward the same destination. The fandom had been trained, over 4 years of embedded cryptograms and coded credit sequences and background symbols, to work exactly this way. Not individually, but collectively, pooling different kinds of attention and different areas of expertise toward a shared, invisible picture. The Cipher hunt was the examination at the end of the course, the final test of everything the show had been teaching. Some people drove hundreds of miles. Some flew. One fan who had solved a significant portion of the digital clues showed up at the forest in Reedsport, Oregon at the end of it all, having tracked the hunt across its entire 13-day run, and stood in front of the statue in the dark and cried. Not from sadness, from the specific, overwhelming quality of something hoped for being real. Of a door you've been walking toward for a very long time finally, actually opening. On the night of August 2nd, 2016, at 7:53 in the evening Pacific Time, a Twitter user walked into a forest in Reedsport, Oregon, and found the statue. She took a photograph. She posted it. Within minutes, multiple groups of fans who had converged on Reedsport that evening descended on the location. Dozens of people, then more. Families with children, fans who had driven hundreds of miles, people who had taken days off work, people who had been following the hunt for 13 days and finally were standing in front of the thing they'd been hunting. There was a treasure chest buried at the statue's base. Inside, plastic coins and gems, foreign currency from Russia and Japan, honoring the fans who had solved clues on the other side of the world. A copy of Journal 3 signed by Hirsch with a personal drawing. A blacklight flashlight. A plastic crown, a sash reading, Mayor of Gravity Falls. A music box with Bill's eye on it front that played the Gravity Falls theme song when wound. A miniature version of the Bill Cipher statue. A framed sketch of the show's main characters standing alongside the real statue, and a USB drive. The USB drive contained an audio message from Grunkle Stan, voiced by Hirsch in character, congratulating the finders. It contained deleted scenes from the show, and it contained login credentials for a website that allowed fans to view the original unaired 2010 pilot episode of Gravity Falls. An early version of the first episode with different artwork and scenes, never publicly released before that night. And then a baby shook the statue's hand. Someone at the scene held their infant up to the stone triangle, guided the tiny hand to the statue's hand and shook it, and posted a video to Twitter with the caption, "A demon baby just shook Bill's hand. Bill's spirit now lives in you, child." The statue eventually moved to its permanent home at Confusion Hill in Piercy, California. It is there now. Fans visit it. They shake its hand, knowing what they're doing, knowing it's the closest thing to making a deal with Bill Cipher that reality will allow. They leave objects in the treasure box for other fans to find. They write their names and dates in the logbook. The entries in that logbook come from every continent. They come from families and solo travelers and groups of college friends and elderly couples and children who watched the show when it first aired in 2012 and are adults now, some of them with children of their own who are discovering it for the first time. The show ran for 2 seasons. It ended in 2016. People are still coming. There is a woman who drove 12 hours alone to get to Confusion Hill with a journal she'd had since she was 13, and a handwritten note she left in the treasure box that no one but the next visitor would ever read. There is a family who made it their summer road trip destination and let their youngest child, who was 7 and had just finished watching the show for the first time, put their hand on the stone triangle and shake it solemnly. There are adults who cried in the parking lot before they even walked in, undone by the distance between who they were when they first watched the show and who they are now. The show is fixed in time, but the people who carry it keep changing, keep growing, keep arriving at the statue with different eyes than the last time. Hirsch said in an interview that he'd wanted to give the fandom one final mystery. Something unexpected, something no other show had done. He said he would rather live in a world where treasure hunts for statues in Oregon forests happen than one where everyone decides things like that are too difficult or too pointless. He said the pointlessness of it inspires the passion. But I think there's something more deliberate underneath that explanation. Gravity Falls, from its very first episode, had asked its audience to pay attention. Not passive attention, active attention. The kind that hunts for things hidden in plain sight, that notices the symbols in the background, and pauses on the cryptograms in the credits and trusts that the effort of noticing will be rewarded. The show had been building this community of careful watchers for 4 years, had been telling them repeatedly that paying attention to this story had value, that the things hidden inside the surface were real and worth finding. The Cipher hunt was the fullest possible expression of that promise. It was Hirsch saying, the attention was real. The community you built around finding these things was real. And here is a real thing to find, out in the world, in real forests, with real clues hidden in real locations. As proof that what happened between this show and its audience was not contained inside a screen. It was always bigger than that. The show was always about mystery. Not as a genre convention, but as a philosophical commitment. The idea that the world contains more than you can see from the surface. That careful attention reveals layers. That the effort of looking is worthwhile. The Cipher hunt was proof that this commitment extended beyond the fictional boundaries of Gravity Falls. The mystery crossed the border between fiction and reality, and it invited the fandom to follow it there. Some doors are worth walking through, even if there's a yellow triangle on the other side, grinning at you from the middle of an Oregon forest, waiting to see if you were paying attention. You were. The treasure chest was real. Closing. What Gravity Falls leaves behind. Those are 10 stories. 10 pieces of a show that is, when you look at it carefully from enough angles, one of the most complete and considered things made for any audience that included children in the last 20 years. Not complete in the sense of having resolved every question. There are still threads in the mythology that trail off into the forest without coming back. Complete in the sense of having been made with genuine care for what it was trying to say and genuine trust that its audience could handle hearing it. The cryptograms in the end credits. The symbols in the backgrounds that meant nothing to a casual viewer and everything to someone paying close attention. The blacklight messages in the companion journals. The cipher keys embedded in episode titles. Every layer of Gravity Falls was built to reward the exact kind of attention that most television shows never ask for and most television audiences never offer. And the show reciprocated that attention with more than the usual amount of truth. Alex Hirsch has talked in interviews about the challenge of making a show that worked simultaneously as a bright, funny adventure for children, and as something with genuine emotional and philosophical weight for the older viewers who came to it. He talks about the choice to trust his audience, to believe that a child watching this show was capable of processing real emotional complexity if it was delivered with enough care. He talks about the memory wipe at the end, the decision to put Stan through something genuinely devastating in the finale rather than giving him an uncomplicated victory, as the choice he was most afraid of and most certain about. What strikes me, having spent this much time in the mythology, is how consistent the show's emotional intelligence is across every scale. The grand arc, the portal and the dimension and the chaos demon, and the world saved at enormous personal cost, carries the same essential themes as the smallest character moments. The bell in Pacifica's father's pocket. The canned beans McGucket stockpiled for a creature he'd been told to freeze. The coffee stand made for the kids when they came down for breakfast at the shack, which the show never commented on, but which was always there. Stan, who was performing not caring, making coffee for children before they woke up. The thing that connects all 10 of these stories, the crashed spacecraft and the destroyed dimension, and the 2 boys on the beach, and the dark partnership, and the memory gun, and the 30 years, and the corrupt child psychic, and the frozen shapeshifter, and the bell, and the real-world treasure hunt, is the same thing that connects every story Gravity Falls ever told. The gap between the face something shows the world and the face it carries underneath. Stan is a cheerful con man, carrying 30 years of quiet devotion. McGucket as the town eccentric, carrying the consequence of a catastrophic decision made in grief. Gideon as a cute child psychic, carrying a corruption that started before he could fully understand it. Pacifica as the most popular girl in Gravity Falls, carrying the weight of conditioning so deep she barely knows it's there. Bill as a chaos demon, carrying the last atoms of a world he destroyed in his hat, performing happiness while running from grief at full speed. Every single one of them is doing it, carrying something under the surface that the surface is specifically designed not to reveal, performing a version of themselves that serves a function: protection, survival, control, the avoidance of unbearable pain, while the actual self does whatever it does in the space underneath the performance. The show is endlessly, genuinely interested in what we carry and what it costs us to carry it, what we choose to remember and what we try to erase, what we hide from the people we love in the name of protecting them, what it means to be made of the place you came from, and what it means to try to become something your origin didn't give you permission to be. These are not small questions. They are not questions that children's television usually bothers with. They are the questions that people carry into adulthood and that most of us spend our whole lives in some relationship with, never fully resolving, only negotiating. And the fact that they were embedded inside a show about two kids with a weird uncle and a pet pig named Waddles, solving mysteries in a forest in Oregon over one strange summer. The fact that all of this depth was folded into something that announced itself as bright and funny and accessible. That is Alex Hirsch's real achievement. Not the ciphers or the Easter eggs or the cryptograms in the credits. The achievement is that you thought you were watching something light, and you absorbed something true. And by the time you understood what had happened, it was already part of you. The summer always ends. That's the other thing the show understands and refuses to look away from. Dipper and Mabel get on a bus at the end of it. They leave. They go home. The Mystery Shack is still there, and Stan is still there, and the valley is still crackling with its ancient impossible energy. But the particular summer that the show was about is over. You cannot stay in the forest forever. You cannot stop the season from turning. And the show, which so perfectly captured the quality of a summer that feels infinite while you're in it, chooses to be honest about the ending of it rather than soft-pedaling it into vague continued adventure. That choice is part of what makes it hurt the way it does. And the hurt is the point. The hurt is the show keeping its promise. It told you it was going to be real with you, and being real with you meant letting the summer end.